We're talking about the Vietnam War, and we left off with the state of Vietnam. And just a quick review of that. Um, the French had held Indochina, which was a combination, here you can see it on the map, of Vietnam, Laos, Thailand, and Cambodia. And they were exploiting that for its rubber and rice. World War II comes along, the Japanese invade, the French have to leave because of the war with the Germans. After World War II, they come back, and a gentleman by the name of Ho Chi Minh, who is seeking to have independence for Vietnam, goes to war against the French. They defeat the French. They kick the French out. The Ho Chi Minh believes he's won independence. He actually was looking a little bit towards America to be an ally. The problem was Ho Chi Minh had ties to communism, and that would not have gone well with the Eisenhower administration. So we don't side up with him. We start to move against him, and we start funneling more and more equipment over there. And when the French leave, then we get involved in South Vietnam with giving more and more aid to the South Vietnamese, training their troops. And now we're going to move on to how the United States becomes more and more involved. We left off with a corrupt president in South Vietnam, a gentleman by the name of Ngo Dinh, and Mr. Dinh was killed on November 2nd of 1963. Mr. Kennedy will be killed on November 22nd of 1963. So 20 days after Ngo Dinh was killed and taken out, Mr. Kennedy's killed, and now you have you have President Johnson, Lyndon Johnson, taking over for him. So Lyndon Johnson is definitely a believer in the domino theory. He is more staunch and more of a war hawk than Mr. Kennedy even was. And he says, you know, we can't withdraw U.S. troops after the death of Dinh because it's going to make us look weak and communism, and we're going to be an appeaser to communism. And yet he needs something to happen to get the U.S. troops involved. And on August 2nd of 1964, there was the small, kind of like a PT boat, which was used in World War II by the Americans. There was 3 of those that attacked one of our destroyers called the USS Maddox. Put a little underline or stars around the USS Maddox name. There's a battle out at sea. The Maddox, they fire off a torpedo. It misses the target. But this is the event that Johnson's looking for to go back to Congress and ask for money and the American people's approval, and he gets it. And so from that incident, the attack on us in August 2nd of 1964, we're going to get the Tonkin Gulf Resolution. Let me say that one more time, the Tonkin Gulf Resolution. That's a big one. Vietnam was never declared a war. Congress did not declare it a war. Congress gave Johnson full authorization with the checkbook to run the war whichever way he wanted, but they didn't declare war. They just gave him the money to fund this military action. So he got that in 1964, at the end of 1964. And by 1965, he's going to start Operation Rolling Thunder. Make sure you start that one. Operation Rolling Thunder is going to be a sustained bombing of Vietnam. We dropped more bombs in Vietnam. Get this, more bombs were dropped by the United States Air Force in Vietnam, on both North Vietnam, on Cambodia, than in all of World War II. Not just the United States dropping bombs in World War II, but all the tonnage combined in World War II. By June of 1965, 50,000 U.S. troops were fighting the Viet Cong. Remember, the Viet Cong are the communists that are inside South Vietnam. So think about this. We go from not being involved with Kennedy to President Dim being killed in the beginning of November of 63, President Kennedy taken out in the end of November of 63, Johnson going into power, the naval battle with the USS Maddox in August of 64, to the Gulf and Tonkin Gulf resolution in end of August of 64, and by 1965 we got 50,000 troops in it, and so we're all in, and we're fighting. The U.S. felt the entire Vietnam incident was going to be a pretty clear and easy victory for us. We had superior weapons. We had a massive firepower over the Viet Cong. We were better trained. We were better equipped. But the Viet Cong had it's in their backyard, and they have the jungle, the terrain, and they use guerrilla tactics. It sounds a lot like what we used in the South in our independence war against the British. And the war will end in a stalemate. The Viet Cong will lack weapons, but what they make up in is they will dictate when they will fight. So they'll do hit and run ambush tactics. They have the knowledge of the terrain. They have all kinds of underground tunnels. They would go in and out of civilian populations, and you would never know who was being the one, the guys that were attacking us, and then they go right back into the cities. Remember, this is the Viet Cong that are fighting and attacking our troops inside South Vietnam. They lace the terrain with booby traps and all kinds of landmines, so our guys have to act real slow and move real slow. And then the weather conditions are just, dense jungle, incredible amounts of rain during the rainy season. It was tough going for us. We had not fought in that kind of terrain on a long scale. General Westmoreland, the head of the U.S. troops, felt the best way to win this war was to show the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese army, the Viet Minh, what are they losing every time they go up against us. So we had a thing called, we were going to fight them through a war of attrition. And the war of attrition would be, we're just going to show every single time when we have a battle how many guys we kill. So this was the introduction of the body count. And we were hoping to scare the Viet Cong and Ho Chi Minh into seeing what they were up against, and then to quit. But the Viet Cong did not quit, and they stood strong with receiving supplies from China and the Soviet Union. One of the things that we did a really poor job in South Vietnam was winning the hearts and minds of the people. And I think that was a great lesson we learned over there, that we did a better job in, say, Afghanistan, in Iraq, in both the first Desert Storm and then the war in Iraq. We would go into there and we would use massive weapons, real bad, ugly weapons like napalm, which we've talked about. It's a gasoline-based bomb that sets fire to the jungle when we'd be attacked by a group of guys, and we would call in airstrikes. We also used Agent Orange that would destroy fields and kill all the foliage. And so if you were a lot of these guys were farmers, and they would lose everything because of these tactics. This makes the local civilian population not like us a lot. And it's hard to win a war when the people that you're supposed to be depending on to tell you who are the bad guys, when the bad guys go out and shoot at us, and then they run back into the civilian population, and the civilians don't want to tell them because they don't trust us. One of the big things that we did in the war was, because the enemy would refuse to fight us on a large-scale battles, we would send our troops out in what was called search and destroy missions. And we would find where the enemy was at, and if the enemy would attack us, we would go into some of these villages and we would uproot the civilians. We would burn all the farms, we'd kill all the livestock, and then we'd relocate these people and populations. They would lose everything. Now, you do that, and maybe 8 of the 10 people that you took in were regular citizens of South Vietnam. 2 of them were Viet Cong, but you destroyed all 10 people's farms and all their livestock and everything. In addition to that, the U.S. troops that we have over there. Remember, this was a discriminatory war in the fact that we had a lot more poor people involved in this war in Southeast Asia, a long ways from the United States, and they were over there fighting in a war. We didn't train them as well as we did in previous wars. The discipline was not near as high. For example, you could not have to shave. You never did that in World War II or Korea. You always were going to be dressed accordingly. It didn't matter. And today, a military guy out in the field, he's going to look the part when he goes up and he meets his commanding officer. He's going to be buttoned up and he's going to look the part of a U.S. soldier. He doesn't show up with a dirty T-shirt untucked and unshaven. That's just unacceptable. And we had that, and there was drinking and there was drug use, rampant drug use by some of our guys over there, and it was a bad situation. In addition, South Vietnam had its own problem with the Civil War and this continued struggle against the Buddhists and the monks and the nuns. The new leader of Vietnam, a guy by the name of Nguyen Khai, he's not as harsh as Diem, but he's not well received by the Vietnamese people either. We are losing troops, as well as the South Vietnamese army are losing troops, and they're being held in North Vietnam in severe conditions, breaking all of the Geneva Convention. And we're finding out about this, and our people back home are starting to really doubt and wonder, why are we doing this? What are we doing over there? So we are now talking about 1967. We've gotten involved in 64 with the USS Maddox being attacked. We get the Tonkin Gulf Resolution, and we have the Operation Rolling Thunder. And we're still, by 1967, the majority of people are still involved and still very pro-war. But that's going to slowly change. The war at home, early on in the war, the economy suffers because of the costly war effort. It costs a lot to go to war, and the media was allowed to have a lot more access. So the living room war is what we called it. They showed, a lot of scenes that you didn't see in other wars. We didn't let that access be there. From 1961 to 1967, we had 16,000 American soldiers die. From 1967 to 1974, when we officially get out, we're going to have a total of 57,000 people die. And the big one is, so we lose. We've lost a significant amount, but when you compare it to other wars, it's nothing. It's nothing compared to World War II, World War I. But it's still, people are saying, what are we doing? What are we winning over there? And the public starts to distrust the statements made from the government about what's really happening over there. And slowly protests start to grow and capture the attention of the entire nation and the media. So we're going to stop right there, and we'll be looking at section 3 in the next lecture.